Hey, long time. I want to talk about Halloween today. It's important. You know why? Because we don't properly address things so many times, and it leaves so many things to go under the cracks. And, we're progressive. We want to get answers. We don't just want to know that something's wrong. I just don't do it. We want to know why. So many of us are confused about what we should do. Is it wrong? Why do we do it? And these things do need answers. I want to talk about the history of it. I want to talk a little bit of what my understanding is of it. I thank God for Answers in Genesis because a lot of my information, factual information, comes from that, and other research that I've done on my own. But it's important to know our stuff. Wouldn't you agree? I would think so. So, Halloween as we know it today originates from the Celts. The Boston Celtics. Celtics. That's where it stems from. And over 2,000 years ago, they pretty much continued this. And they weren't the only culture to do it as well. But it was called Samhain, which was the Day of the Dead. And on that day, they sacrificed plants, people, and animals. And that was just what was done. Human sacrificing and sacrificing in general. Now, the ones who performed this operation were called Druids, and they were the religious leaders and scholars who rose up in Ireland and Britain at that time, in these Germanic tribes. And what they would do, when I say they rose up, they pretty much, because they were scholars and because they were the priests and the priestess, they deviated from what was at that time, what was instituted. Remember the early church and all that was going on. And they kind of went more towards paganism, and they adopted a polytheistic mentality, pretty much many gods, and the ancestor worship they did as well. And pretty much they just deviated from the standard or the norm of, well, pretty much what God was saying through His Word and anything like that. And that was done for them. But remember, the Celts are the one who brought it over to the United States. All right, Samhain. But the excuse me, they brought it over. It was brought over through the Roman Catholic Church and in the church world. And the reason why it got into the church world was because it was present in many cultures. And the Roman culture was present as well as it was the Germanic tribes. Remember, when Rome fell, there was a merger of those things together. All right, so there was a mixing. But to get the actual name that we now know as Halloween today, an interesting thing happens, and this is something that I want us to really pay attention to, because if you pay attention, you'll see the same thing that happens now and is happening in our culture. History repeats itself. That's one thing we should always know and never forget. In the early 600s AD, Boniface IV, who was a Roman Pope, Catholic Pope, created All Saints' Day on May 13th. Now let's see what happens after. Remember, there's tension, there's pressure, there's pull. For 100 years. 100 years later, Pope Gregory comes in and he changes the date that was there from May 13th to November 1st. Why? Because he wants to merge together Day of the Dead, Samhain, alright, or in the Celts culture, Samhain, but the Day of the Dead, when the Romans honored, and he wanted to merge that with All Saints' Day. And now we have a combination of people who are supposed to be church-going people mixing in with paganism, and because it's compounded over years, then the initial abstaining from evil becomes dormant and they become used to it. So he changed the date now to compensate for that, and later on in the mid-700s AD, they combined the days now to form 3 days. So now they're going to have a day called All Souls Day. All Saints Day was November 1st, and All Hallows Eve, which is the day before All Saints Day, was the Day of the Dead. And they called it All Hallows Eve, or the Eve, or Hallows Even, which turns into Halloween. So that Day of the Dead, the Samhain, turned into All Hallows Eve. November 1st was All Saints Day, and then November 2nd, now in the mid-700s, became the day of All Souls Day. This is the combination 3-in-1. Do we see any similarities? It was the persistence and the underlying tone that worked its way in over time to mix. Something to really think about. Now, I say the Days of the Dead a lot, but what's the connection between the Days of the Dead and Halloween? Well, starting with 1, the dead are honored. Many Days of the Dead, like Halloween, ends from summer to fall. That's 2. 3, remembrance of sin is present. And 4, sacrifices are being made. So not only is there similarities, but the Day of the Dead has also been known in many cultures. So we had it, I mentioned 2 cultures, and I said the Germanic and the Roman cultures. Those are 2 different cultures in Europe. But then also over here through the Aztecs and the Olmecs and Mexico and Brazil on this side, it was over here as well. And then that's also celebrated in Japan and China and Korea, the Hindi, the Philippines. You know, when you think about the same kind of basic roots, you think about paganism in the sense that multiple gods, reincarnation, ancestral worship, these are all similar in these cultures through the Day of the Dead. And these cultures all celebrate it. Alright. Well, that's all good and well, but why am I saying all these and why am I bringing this up? Because when we're doing research, we have to always try to accurately trace things back to a root, and when we see similarities in cultures, then we can know, alright, there's something that was a main event at one point in time because people were all together, even the continents were, and things dispersed, and when it dispersed, we had people's version of what happened, but it comes from a similar trait, it comes from similar things. So, when I mentioned the Day of the Dead, the one thing that links all these things together, which is very, very interesting, is these sacrifices were known as flood sacrifices. Verified by John Urquhart and Alfred Rehwinkel, who was a theology professor at Concordia, or he was. I don't know if he's still alive. But these 2 individuals verify that these Days of the Dead were flood rituals or flood worship, flood sacrifices. That's what they were called, or they can be traced back to the flood. Because no matter what culture you go in, there was always an account of a flood, a major flood that happened one day, and everyone wants to put their ideas on it. Now, I'm going to link what I'm about to say to paganism and preference what I talk about paganism, and when we experience paganism in our day and when we're currently there, what really is it? Hear this now as I talk about paganism and I talk about this correlation that I'm making here between all of these cultures and the flood and paganism. This is what I want to really make clear to everyone. The devil cannot originate anything, which means that anything that we see comes from God. For example, Halloween, we see the cat, we see the bat, we see the moon, we see the pumpkin. God made all of those things. And the thing that we have to understand about paganism is knowing that there is God, knowing that he exists, and trying to replace him with your version of yourself or your God to yourself. Almost like another religion. So now that draws us into the real deep meaning behind everything. What's wrong with celebrating Halloween? What's wrong with the whole giving candy and all of that? It's pagan. Pagan means you're substituting an idea for what you want to do as opposed to God, replacing God with your idea, which is what happened to all these cultures. Now, if we think about it and we think deeply about it, looking at all the cultures and looking at where we are right now, we can see a similarity, we can see trends, we can see things that seep through. But oftentimes we don't see the heart. For example, they're all doing blood sacrifices because they had to learn blood sacrifices from somewhere. Yes, precisely. Where did they learn it from? Tracing it back to the flood, what's the correlation? Who was the person? Wait a minute. After the rainbow was shown in the sky to Noah from God, God told Noah to make sacrifices. Why? Is that a great thing? Why do they have to make sacrifices? They had to make sacrifices and do it exactly the way God specified, because when Adam and Eve sinned and they were naked, sacrifice had to be made for atonement for what was done for sin. Now that was extremely important that I said that. And the reason why is because we have all these terms that we hear from the Bible, but we have no understanding of the depth of what they mean. Sacrificing and human sacrifice is not something that God likes. It's only an atonement because of sin. God hates sin. But in order, he needs justice. And when he gave this earth to the man, and the man forfeited that right, sin covered the man, sin covered the women, sin covered the earth. So God said, curses the ground for your sake. It's cursed, but it's for your sake. Why? Death is now in the world. And that's why these animals have to die and they have to be sacrificed because of sin, because of your sin and my sin and everything that we've done in between. That is key in understanding. So now, that's what Noah did from God in a specific way that God set it up in that covenant. And now, if the people that try to, they veered off, they still do those sacrifices because that's the tradition they learned. But why are they doing it? Well, once you veer off and you put your own ideas into it, bad things happen. What was the truth of the matter? Jesus Christ, just to make it short, is our sin offering. That means we don't still celebrate death. We don't celebrate it at all. Death had to be atoned for in a certain covenant at a certain time, the way God instructed it, until he came back in the form of his Son to come into our hearts. Because that is the reality, that's why those sacrifices happen. Those sacrifices continued in paganistic cultures. So now we understand the meaning behind why sacrifices were in the first place and why God had to do it, because he had to atone for sin. But when he came down through his Son, he wants us all to receive. So why would we celebrate a holiday that still represents these sacrifices? There's a deeper thing going on here, ladies and gentlemen. Paganism, and what I'm saying to you what paganism is it's replacing God with your theology, with your philosophy, your version of God. Knowing God is real, but replacing him and going a different way down your own road. You think about many gods as opposed to one God. Well, that's just an idea that somebody thinks of, and they go with it. Think about creation. Are we exposed to that in today's time? Yes, we are, because we have evolutionists, people who just believe in the physical, but basing creation off of death. You mean to tell me, and this is a great analogy that I heard, you mean to tell me that this beautiful life we have and everything that we live was only because all these insignificant pieces or animals and things had to die so that we could come? It's based off of death as opposed to life. Creation, the creator. Who's the creator? We are, in essence, the creator, and we were always in whatever was the liquids or whatever. Humanistic thinking, one world religion, the rainbow. The rainbow, what's paganism? It's taking what the rainbow actually represented, what God's covenant was to Noah, out of its context, how it naturally appeared in the sky, fabricating it in the form of a flag or lighting up buildings to represent what we think is the rainbow colors and what they should represent. It's all paganism. And it's so subtle. And we hear it all the time today. People say it all the time. I'm not religious. They think they're spiritual but not religious. In fact, Mercer, the man who shot up all of those people who's targeting Christians, he says, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, but I'm interested in pagan and Wiccan. Or Wiccan, I don't know how you say it, Wiccan. Does that not sound similar? Oh, we feel comfortable because we don't want to be the philosophy of the religious church, and we're not religious, we're spiritual now. But what does that mean? Listen, I'm talking with passion to you today because I need to let you know that we're under attack. Things are so subtle in how they come in. Halloween. If you heard this message today, you be the judge for yourself. I'm going to read scripture verse. I'm going to finish off with some scripture that I now have here that I want to read on not only the times, but what God says in His Word on what to do. Now, this is important. There's a decision you have to make today on what to do. The way to do it has to be directed by God and also your authorities. For example, the one thing that we should know about Halloween is we should not associate with any form of paganism. This is very crucial. The way to go about doing that, this is important that you go to your spiritual authority, to your local church, and discuss how that would be done. For example, some churches have Reformation, and they celebrate Reformation on the 31st going into the 1st. Or what led to the Reformation. They celebrate that. Some people have trunk or treat, and trunk or treat is an alternative. There's candy, there's things involved, but it's an alternative. Why is it an alternative? Because we're inundated in the culture. We're not coming from a perspective where this culture is trying to come. We're coming from a perspective where we're in this culture now. And we have to have alternatives for kids going to stores and seeing candy and having candy passed out to them in their very schools. How do you combat that in a correct way? There are many different forms. Some people abstain completely. I'm not telling you the way you're doing it is or how the way you're going to do it. That needs to be directed by God through His Spirit and where He placed you. But what I will tell you is there's one thing you need to know, and that is you cannot associate with death. You cannot celebrate death. Halloween is the celebration of death. Jesus came to celebrate so we can celebrate life, His life, and end death. A cross is only associated with Christians because Jesus died on the cross. But the cross represents death to the Romans. They killed people on the cross. Jesus came on the cross to show that He did away with death. He took our sin on what death represented, and He conquered death. He conquered the cross. So let me read some scripture that I got now. I'm going to read how serious we need to take this, how subtle things are, but how serious we need to take this. 1 Corinthians 10:20. Paul is saying, no, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. What's happening now? If we ignore and ignore and ignore what God's telling, what God's saying, God's principles and values, and we continue to take them out little by little, we become a paganistic society, and that means we will be left over to a reprobate or debased mindset, which represents the time. So Judges 21:25, which is a representation of this, says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It's just a description, can be taken for the times now. Also, Titus 1:15, the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are, to the pure all things are pure. But to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But even their mind and conscience are defiled. So we can't be reasoning. We have to show the light. And not everyone's going to understand you, but that's okay. You have to be fine with that. Romans 1:20-21. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, God's invisible attributes, are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, they who are choosing to willfully ignore the Lord. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Picks up in verses 28-29, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do the things which are not fitting to do. A debased mind cannot see straight. So let's be very careful. The more we give in to this type of thinking and we make ourselves God, is the more we think things that are wrong are right, and we think it's all right, and it's really not. A very powerful, potent message. I hope you chime in on this. We can talk about things. But let's talk about things. Let's just not be like, oh, it's Halloween, I don't want nothing to do with it. Be progressive, be proactive, but know, Christian, know the history and know why you do what you do even if it's very minute to you.